The morning Nathaniel Brooks walked into First Meridian Bank. He carried nothing but a worn leather briefcase, a calm expression, and 57 years of a life most people would never guess just by looking at him. Charlotte was doing what Charlotte does best on a Tuesday in October. The sky so blue and clean it almost hurt to look at. The air sharp with that particular kind of autumn crispness that makes the city feel alive and purposeful. On Tryon Street, the financial district hummed with the rhythm of serious money. Men in tailored suits moved in and out of glass buildings like pieces on a chessboard, each one projecting the particular brand of confidence that comes from knowing your account balance before you order breakfast. Nate noticed all of it. He always noticed everything. 26 years in the United States Army had made observation second nature, a skill that saved lives in Baghdad, in Kabul, in places most Americans would struggle to find on a map. He had learned long ago that the details other people overlook are usually the ones that matter most. He pushed through the heavy revolving door of First Meridian's flagship Charlotte branch and stepped onto polished marble floors. The lobby was deliberately impressive. High ceilings, tasteful lighting, the kind of quiet that banks manufacture to make you feel like money itself is a sacred, serious thing. A waterfall feature ran along the far wall. Abstract bronze sculptures sat on pedestals near the seating area. The message was unmistakable. We are the kind of institution that belongs to a certain class of people. Nate walked to the reception desk and smiled at the young woman seated there. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady and warm. "My name is Nathaniel Brooks. I have an appointment to speak with someone in commercial lending." The receptionist, her name badge read Tanya, glanced up from her screen. Something crossed her face. Not rudeness exactly. More like the automatic calculation people perform when they're deciding how much attention a person deserves. Nate was wearing clean dark slacks, a well-pressed blue Oxford shirt, and leather shoes that were good quality but not flashy. No watch you could spot from across a room. No designer brand stamped visibly anywhere on his body. His silver hair was cut close, his face clean-shaved, and his posture was the kind of straight that never fully leaves people who spent decades in uniform. "Do you have an appointment confirmation number?" Tanya asked. "I do." He gave it to her calmly, without irritation. She found it in the system and picked up the phone. A brief exchange. She set it down. "Someone will be with you shortly. You can wait in the seating area." "Thank you, Tanya." He said her name with the kind of genuine warmth that catches people off guard. She blinked, like she wasn't used to it. Nate settled into one of the leather chairs near the waterfall and set his briefcase on his knee. Around him, the bank moved with deliberate professionalism. Tellers processed transactions behind thick glass. Analysts moved between offices with the focused energy of people who never stopped thinking about numbers. Somewhere in the back, phones rang in steady succession. He watched all of it and felt, not anxiety, not excitement, just a steady, patient interest. The kind of curiosity a surgeon might feel walking through a hospital he was considering purchasing, because that was in fact not an entirely inaccurate analogy. After about 12 minutes, he counted, not because he was impatient, but because in the army you always counted. A man appeared from a back corridor and moved toward him with the brisk walk of someone who has already decided the meeting will be brief. Richard Coleman was 48 years old, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since hardened into something more like authority. His suit was expensive. His tie was a signal. He wore cufflinks that caught the lobby light when he extended his hand. "Mr. Brooks?" He said the name the way people say names they are not sure deserve much weight yet. "That's right." Nate stood, and they shook hands. Richard's grip was firm and quick, the handshake of a man performing professionalism rather than feeling it. "Richard Coleman, branch manager. Please follow me." They walked through a corridor that opened into a private meeting room. Glass walls on two sides, a dark wood conference table, a subtle painting of a mountain landscape on the interior wall. Richard gestured to a seat across from him and settled into the chair on the power side of the table. "So," Richard said, setting his own folder on the table without opening it. "What can First Meridian do for you today, Mr. Russ?" "Brooks?" Nate set his briefcase on the table, opened it with a quiet click, and removed a meticulously organized set of documents. A business plan, financial projections, a portfolio summary, a project proposal. He laid them out with the same precision he once used to brief generals. "I'm looking to secure a commercial loan," Nate said. $750,000 to support the expansion of a program I run called the Brooks Veterans Initiative. We provide business development resources, mentorship infrastructure, and transitional support for veterans entering civilian entrepreneurship. We've operated in 3 states for the past 6 years, with a documented success rate of 83% among participants who complete the full program cycle. Richard picked up one of the pages and glanced at it the way a man glances at a restaurant menu when he's already decided he's not hungry. His eyes moved but didn't read. "And what collateral are you proposing to offer?" "Everything is outlined in the financial package," Nate said. "But the short version is that the loan would be backed by real estate assets and business equity, with a combined appraised value comfortably above the loan amount." Richard set the page down without comment. He looked at Nate with the measured expression of someone who has constructed a conclusion and is now working backward to justify it. "Mr. Brooks, I want to be straightforward with you. $750 is a significant commercial request. We have to look at cash flow, credit depth, business history, the full picture." "Of course," Nate said. "All of that is in the package I've just given you." "I appreciate that. But from what I'm seeing here, I'm not sure First Meridian is the right fit for this particular request." He paused in the way people pause when they want what they're saying to land with a certain weight. "There are community lenders and nonprofit financing structures that might be better aligned with a program of this nature. Organizations specifically designed to support—" He paused again, and the pause was its own kind of sentence. "Projects at this stage of development." The room was quiet for a moment. Nate looked at Richard with the same calm, level gaze he had held throughout the entire meeting. Not anger, not offense, not the performance of dignity that people put on when they're scrambling to feel dignified. Just stillness. "I see," Nate said. "It's nothing personal, of course," Richard added with the particular smoothness of someone who has delivered variations of this speech many times. "We just want to make sure clients are working with institutions that can serve their specific needs." "Of course," Nate said. He gathered his documents with the same unhurried precision with which he had laid them out. Each page returned to its proper place. The briefcase closed with the same quiet click. He stood, extended his hand. "I appreciate your time, Mr. Coleman." Richard shook it, the same quick performing handshake as before. "Best of luck with the initiative." Nate nodded once, buttoned the top button of his shirt with a small, unhurried motion, and walked back through the corridor into the lobby. He paused at the reception desk. "Thank you, Tanya. Have a good rest of your morning." She looked up, and something in his composure made her feel, for a reason she couldn't quite name, a little ashamed. "You too, sir." The revolving door moved. He stepped out onto Tryon Street. The October air hit him, clean and cold and full of possibility. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone and dialed. After one ring, a voice answered. "Marcus, it's Nate." A pause. "Move forward with the building." Another pause. Then, "Yes, all of it." He slid the phone back into his pocket and walked down the street at the same calm, deliberate pace he had walked in. Around him, Charlotte moved and breathed and counted its money. The waterfall inside First Meridian kept falling. Richard Coleman was already thinking about his next appointment. And 3 days later, nothing about that building would belong to the same people it belonged to right now. Olivia Martinez had worked in commercial banking for 11 years, and in that time she had developed an instinct for the moments when something was wrong. Not wrong like a number out of place in a spreadsheet, but wrong the way a room feels wrong when the temperature drops 2 degrees for no visible reason. She had felt it the moment Richard walked back through the corridor after his meeting with the man in the blue Oxford shirt. He moved with the particular looseness of a person who has just handled something he considers beneath him. Tie still perfect, coffee in hand, already scanning his phone for what came next. "Client from the 10 o'clock slot?" she asked, turning from her desk near the glass partition. Richard set his coffee on the edge of the counter. "Referred out. Olivia looked at the empty meeting room, then back at him. What was the request? Commercial loan. $750. He shrugged in the way people shrug when they want you to understand that a conversation is already over. Not a fit. Olivia kept her voice neutral. Did you run the full analysis? Richard looked at her with the mild, patient expression of a man explaining something obvious to someone he is working hard not to condescend to. I've been doing this for 16 years, Olivia. I can read a room. She looked at the file folder he had set on the counter. The papers from Nathaniel Brooks's briefcase, which had been left behind accidentally, or more precisely, which Richard had failed to return. She reached for the top page. Richard didn't stop her. He didn't think it mattered. Olivia pulled out the first document and started reading. Her eyes moved steadily, the way eyes move when information is landing and being sorted and weighed at the same time. The first page was a business summary for the Brooks Veterans Initiative, operating in North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia. 6 years of continuous operation, 83% success rate among program completers, transitioning into civilian business ownership. Annual budget last fiscal year, $4.2 million. Documented sources, private investment, federal grant programs, and, she turned the page, the Brooks Holdings Group, identified as the primary sponsor and largest single funder of the initiative. She turned another page. Brooks Holdings Group, founded 2003. Real estate development, strategic investments, portfolio across 14 states. Estimated current value. She stopped reading. She read that number again. Then she looked up at the door through which Nathaniel Brooks had walked out of First Meridian Bank 16 minutes ago. Documents in hand, declined without a complete review. Referred to a community lender like a man who had come in asking for a personal loan to start a food truck. She looked at Richard. Richard was on his phone, responding to an email about an afternoon meeting. Richard? Her voice was very level. Did you look at the collateral package he submitted? He didn't submit a complete package. He submitted a 6-page financial summary, a project expansion plan, and a 2-page portfolio overview from Brooks Holdings Group. Richard glanced over. The project overview wasn't sufficient for a commercial. His portfolio overview lists a real estate asset base that's currently valued at... She set the page down on the counter in front of him, pointing to the number with one finger. She didn't say the number out loud. She didn't need to. Richard looked at the page. The coffee in his hand didn't move. He didn't move. He just looked at the number the way people look at numbers that rearrange the furniture in their assumptions. That can't be right, he said finally, in a voice that was working hard to stay bored. It's a portfolio summary with audited valuations attached. Olivia kept her voice completely, professionally calm. Richard, the loan he was requesting was, at most, a fraction of his documented net asset position. He wasn't asking for anything he couldn't cover 3 times over out of liquid assets. Richard set down his coffee. He picked up the page. He read it. He set it back down. He should have led with this, he said. Olivia was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. He did lead with it, she said. It was in the package he placed on the table in front of you. The glass lobby outside continued to move and function around them. Tellers counting, phones ringing, the waterfall falling, the city going about its business. Someone outside the window walked by in a coat the color of November coming early. Richard straightened his tie. Pull together a corrective outreach file, he said. We'll reach out, clarify that there may have been a process issue, and invite him to... He already left the building, Richard. Then we get his contact information from the appointment system and follow up. He left. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. And based on what I've seen in this file, I don't think a follow-up phone call is going to be the part of this story that he remembers. She set the folder on the counter between them. Richard picked it up. He carried it back to his office. He sat down at his desk in a private, air-conditioned room and opened the full package that Nathaniel Brooks had handed him with careful, unhurried hands exactly 23 minutes ago, and which he had set aside after 45 seconds because he had been very certain, in the deeply confident way of a man who trusts his own read of people, that the man sitting across from him was not someone First Meridian needed to take seriously. He read every page. He read it the way you read something when you understand that every sentence is a verdict on a decision you already made. By the time he reached the last page, the coffee on his desk had gone cold. Meanwhile, 2 floors above the street, in a glass-fronted corner office in a building 5 blocks north on Tryon, a man named Marcus Webb, 34 years old, vice president of acquisitions for the Brooks Holdings Group, was moving quickly through a set of documents that had been prepared over the preceding 3 weeks. The offer had already been structured. The legal work was complete. The financing had been arranged through a consortium of 3 institutional partners, all of them longtime collaborators with the group. The purchase was not impulsive and had not been triggered by what happened in the bank that morning exactly. It had been planned, evaluated, negotiated, and brought to readiness over months. But the timing of the closing had been flexible, and after Nate's phone call, the timing was now fixed. Marcus signed 3 documents, sent 1 email, made 2 phone calls. The 3rd phone call went to the law firm handling the transaction. "We're moving to close by end of business Thursday," he said. "Make sure everything is ready." The attorney on the other end of the line said the words Marcus had expected to hear, because Nate ran things in a way that made sure the expected words were the ones people said. "We're ready." Marcus hung up, leaned back in his chair, and looked out at the Charlotte skyline, with the expression of someone who has watched his boss operate long enough to understand that when Nate Brooks says very little and moves very calmly, the effect on the people who underestimated him tends to be significant. Down on Tryon Street, inside First Meridian Bank, Olivia Martinez was back at her desk. She had a client call at noon and 3 internal reviews scheduled for the afternoon. She opened her laptop and began working through her notes, but she kept thinking about the man in the blue Oxford shirt, about the way he had gathered his papers, about the way he had thanked the receptionist by name on his way out, about the way he had moved through the lobby of a bank that had just told him, without quite using the words, that he did not look like someone whose business mattered, and had moved through it with a dignity so complete and so quiet that it was almost like watching someone refuse to give an unworthy audience any more of their time than they had already received. She thought about what that kind of composure costs a person, and she thought about what it means when a person has so thoroughly stopped needing a room's approval that they can walk out of a room that just insulted them and feel not wounded, not humiliated, not even particularly surprised, just finished with it. She thought about that for a while. Then she turned back to her work. Outside, Charlotte moved through its Tuesday. The sky stayed perfectly, indifferently blue, and Thursday was coming. On Wednesday morning, Marcus Webb stood in the parking structure adjacent to First Meridian's Tryon Street building and looked up at the glass facade with the careful, assessing attention of someone who has been trained by years of real estate acquisition work to look at structures the way doctors look at bodies, not what they appear to be on the surface, but what they are holding, what they cost to maintain, what they are worth to the right person for the right purpose. The building was 14 floors, constructed in 2001, primarily commercial, with First Meridian occupying the lower 3 floors and subletting the remaining 11 to a mix of financial advisory firms, legal offices, and 1 mid-sized accounting practice. The HVAC system was aging but had been maintained responsibly. The foundation was excellent. The electrical infrastructure had been upgraded 8 years ago. The location, a full city block on Tryon Street in the center of Charlotte's financial district, was worth, in Marcus's professional assessment, considerably more in 2024 than the sellers understood. That gap between what sellers thought a thing was worth and what it was actually worth was, fundamentally, where the Brooks Holdings Group had made a great deal of its money over 21 years. Marcus's phone buzzed. He answered it without looking at the screen because he knew who was calling. "Good morning," Nate said. "Morning. I'm outside the building now. You want the walkthrough summary?" "No." A brief pause. "I've walked the building twice already. I wanted to ask you something else." Marcus waited. "Did you look at the atrium space on the ground floor? The area they're currently using for employee parking validation and a small cafe?" That's the one. I looked at it. What did you see? Marcus turned away from the building and leaned against the parking structure railing, looking out at the city. About 4,000 square feet of underutilized prime ground floor real estate in the heart of the financial district, currently generating maybe 12% of its potential revenue. And? Marcus smiled, though Nate couldn't see it. And if you gutted the validation kiosks and the cafe and opened it up completely, redesigned the flow, put in training rooms, a resource center, a business development hub, how many people could move through that space in a week? At full programming capacity? Marcus did the math quickly, the way he always did. With rotating cohorts, workshop rotations, and open resource hours, 3, maybe 350 depending on scheduling density. A brief silence. That's what I saw too, Nate said. You want to use the whole ground floor for the initiative expansion. I want to use the whole ground floor, Nate said, for the thing I was trying to tell the bank I needed the loan to build. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, so you were serious about the loan application? I'm always serious about the programs, Nate said. The loan itself was, he paused, an experiment. Marcus had worked with Nate for 9 years. He had learned in that time that when Nate called something an experiment, what he meant was that he had already known what the result would be, had run the test anyway, and was now deciding what to do with confirmed data. What does the result tell you? Marcus asked. It tells me that the institution operates the way I thought it operated. Nate's voice was even, uncolored by heat, which means the partnership conversation I was planning to initiate with them will need to start from a different place than I originally intended. Meaning they'll be sitting across the table from you rather than above you. Meaning, Nate said carefully, that we'll be having an honest conversation about what it actually costs to treat people the way they were treated in that building yesterday, and about what it looks like when an institution decides to choose differently. Marcus looked back at the building. 14 floors of glass and steel reflecting the October sky. The close is tomorrow, Marcus said. I know. You want me there? Yes. Bring Elena and the full legal team. Elena Reyes was the group's chief legal counsel. 41 years old, relentlessly precise, and widely regarded among Charlotte's real estate community as the kind of attorney who closed deals with the efficiency of someone who has anticipated every objection 3 days in advance. Done, Marcus said. What time do you want to arrive? I'll be there at 10, Nate said. I'll come through the front door. He said it the way people say things that mean exactly what they say and nothing more. I'll be there, Marcus said. They ended the call. Marcus put his phone in his pocket and stood there a moment longer, looking at the building. Somewhere on the ground floor, he knew, a man named Richard Coleman was already at his desk, probably reviewing his morning client list, probably thinking about numbers and meetings and the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, unaware that the man he had turned away yesterday morning had, at 11:47 a.m. that same day, authorized the completion of a transaction that would make him the new owner of the building Richard worked in. Marcus thought about what that was going to feel like. Not for Nate, who was past the need to savor reversals, but for the institution itself, for the people in it, for the particular quality of silence that falls over a room when understanding arrives, and there is nothing left to say. He thought it was probably going to feel in some way that was hard to precisely name, like a lesson. He hoped, genuinely, that it was the kind of lesson that stuck. He walked to his car. He had documents to review. Thursday was 22 hours away. Inside First Meridian Bank, at 10:08 on Wednesday morning, Richard Coleman was not at his desk. He was in a hallway near the break room, speaking in a low, controlled voice on his cell phone. The call was to a colleague at another branch, a man named Gerald, who Richard trusted enough to use as a sounding board when something was bothering him in a way he did not want to examine too directly. I may have made an error in judgment on an application yesterday, Richard said. He kept his voice measured, the way a person keeps their voice measured when they are choosing, very carefully, how much of a thing to admit. What kind of error? Gerald asked. I declined a commercial request without completing a full review. A pause. The client's documented financial position. He stopped. Started again. Gerald, The numbers in his portfolio summary were not what I expected based on. A pause that lasted long enough to say the thing Richard was not going to say. Based on my initial read of the situation. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He knew Richard. He knew what the pause meant, and he was kind enough, or cautious enough, not to name it directly. Do you have contact information for the client? Yes. Then call him. Today. I'm not sure a call is... Richard. Gerald's voice was not unkind, but it had a firmness to it. Call the man. Today. Whatever happened, you call him. You acknowledge the process fell short, and you extend a proper invitation to continue. That's what you do. Richard stood in the hallway with the phone pressed to his ear and the sound of the break room coffee machine running behind him. You're right, he said. I usually am, Gerald said. Call me after. Richard ended the call. He walked to his office. He sat down. He opened the appointment system, found Nathaniel Brooks's contact number, and stared at it for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Then he picked up the phone. It rang twice. A polished, professional voicemail greeting answered. He left a message. He was careful with his words. He apologized for the process. He said the application deserved a more thorough review. He said he hoped to continue the conversation at Mr. Brooks' convenience. He ended the call. He put the phone down. He felt, for approximately 8 minutes, that he had done the responsible thing, and that the worst of it was behind him. He had no way of knowing that the next morning, at 10 o'clock, Nathaniel Brooks would come back through the front door of First Meridian Bank, not as a loan applicant, but as the man who now owned the building they were all sitting in. Thursday arrived the way October Thursdays arrive in Charlotte, clean and bright and indifferent to the drama of the people moving through it. The sky was the same high blue it had been on Tuesday. The air still had that autumn edge. Tryon Street moved in its usual current of suits and briefcases, and the low, continuous hum of the financial district, doing what it does between 9 and 5. Inside First Meridian Bank, the morning had begun with an unusual notice. It appeared in the branch manager's email at 7:42 a.m., and in the inboxes of all senior staff 11 minutes later. The sender was identified as the office of the regional president of First Meridian Bank, a man named William Harris, whose communication with individual branches was typically limited to quarterly performance reviews and the occasional all-staff memo about regulatory compliance. The email was brief. It read, in its entirety, all senior branch staff, please be present in the main conference room at 10 a.m. today. This is a mandatory attendance meeting. The nature of the agenda will be addressed at the meeting itself. Please ensure no client appointments are scheduled in the 10 to 11 window. This meeting is of significant institutional importance. W. Harris, Regional President. Richard Coleman read this email 3 times. He was not a man who frightened easily, and he was experienced enough in the culture of banking to know that ominous memos were often less ominous in person than they appeared in writing. But there was something about the combination of significant institutional importance and nature of the agenda will be addressed at the meeting itself that created in the part of his mind where discomfort lived a particular kind of quiet. He forwarded the email to Gerald with 3 words in the body. See what I mean? Gerald responded within 4 minutes. What did you do? Richard did not respond to that. At 9:55, the conference room on the 2nd floor of First Meridian's Tryon Street branch began filling with people who were projecting varying degrees of confused professionalism. Olivia Martinez arrived at 9:58 and took a seat near the window. She had read the email with a different quality of attention than most of her colleagues, less the anxiety of someone who does not know what is coming, and more the quiet alertness of someone who has a theory and is waiting to find out if it is correct. At 9:59, a man she had never met walked into the conference room and introduced himself briskly as Derek Vance, associate counsel to the Brooks Holdings Group. He set a leather portfolio on the table and said nothing else. He was followed by a woman named Elena Reyes, whom Olivia recognized. She had been featured 18 months ago in a Charlotte Business Journal profile about the 10 most influential attorneys in the state. Elena sat beside Derek, arranged 2 documents in front of her, and looked at the room with the expression of someone who has been to dozens of these meetings and knows precisely how they go. At 10:02, William Harris entered. He was 62 years old, broadly built, with gray hair and the deliberate, measured presence of someone who has managed large institutions for long enough to understand that the way a leader enters a room tells the room everything about what kind of meeting this is going to be. He was followed by Marcus Webb, and Marcus was followed by Nathaniel Brooks. Nate walked into that conference room the same way he had walked into the bank 3 days ago, unhurried, upright, with the kind of self-possession that does not announce itself but simply exists, like a load-bearing wall. He was wearing a charcoal suit this time, fitted without being flashy, and he carried the same worn leather briefcase. He looked around the room at the assembled staff of the branch that had declined his loan application, and his expression was nothing dramatic, not triumph, not satisfaction, something closer to the look of a person who has returned to do work. The room was very quiet. Richard Coleman, seated at the far end of the table, went through a sequence of recognitions that happened quickly enough to be almost simultaneous. First, the face. Second, the suit, the briefcase. Third, the context. The attorneys, Marcus Webb, William Harris, the email that morning. Fourth, the understanding of what all of those pieces assembled together meant. He did not visibly react, but the color of his face changed in the specific, subtle way that color changes when blood reroutes to deal with something the body recognizes as a crisis, before the mind has fully caught up. William Harris waited until everyone was settled. Then he spoke. "I want to thank you all for being here. I'll be direct because I think direct is the appropriate approach today." He paused, not for drama but for the kind of genuine weight that sometimes needs a moment of air around it. This building, this branch, the 14 floors above it, and the full property on which it stands, was purchased 2 days ago by the Brooks Holdings Group. The transaction closed yesterday evening. He gestured toward Nate. Mr. Nathaniel Brooks, founder and chairman of the Brooks Holdings Group, is the new owner of this property and will be present throughout the transition period. He let that settle. A few people looked at Nate. A few people looked at their hands. One analyst near the back of the room looked at the wall with the expression of someone replaying recent conversations and asking himself whether he said anything he would regret. Olivia looked at Nate. He looked back at her briefly, not in recognition because they had not spoken before, but with the kind of acknowledgement that passes between people who both understand the dimensions of a moment. "Mr. Brooks has asked to address the team," Harris said. "I'll step back." Nate stood. He didn't use notes. He didn't need to. 3 days ago, he said, I walked into this branch as a prospective borrower. I requested a commercial loan to support an expansion of the Brooks Veterans Initiative, a program that has helped hundreds of veterans transition into civilian entrepreneurship over the past 6 years. I submitted a complete financial package. I waited my turn. I was polite as I always try to be. He paused, and I was declined within 20 minutes without a complete review of my application, and was suggested, gently, to seek a different kind of institution. Silence. I want to be clear about something, Nate continued. I did not come here on Tuesday because I needed the money. The amount I requested represents approximately 0.4% of the assets currently held by the Brooks Holdings Group. I could have written a personal check. He said this without any particular emphasis, which made it land harder than if he had leaned into it. I came here because I was considering First Meridian as a potential institutional partner for a broader initiative, and I wanted to understand firsthand what the experience of walking into this branch would be like for someone who did not present obvious markers of wealth. The room was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system. What I experienced was not violent. It was not overtly hostile. It was something more subtle than that, and in some ways more costly. He looked slowly around the room. It was the experience of being assessed before being seen, of having a decision made before the evidence was reviewed, and of being redirected toward resources for people with fewer resources, by someone who had not looked at my financial documents long enough to know what they contained. Richard Coleman was looking at the table in front of him. His hands were flat on the surface. He was not looking up. "I am not here to punish this institution," Nate said. "I am here because I believe that the people in this room are capable of something better than what happened on Tuesday. And I am in a position, as the owner of this building and as someone who has built partnerships with financial institutions across 14 states, to help this branch become something better if the people here choose to do that work." He paused. "That choice is yours. It will always be yours." He sat down. The room stayed quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then William Harris thanked everyone for their time and announced that individual conversations would follow in the coming days. He closed by acknowledging that a process review of the branch's client evaluation procedures had already been initiated, and that further communication would come from the regional office. People began moving. The room softened into the sound of chairs and conversations. Olivia stood. She moved toward Nate, who was speaking quietly with Marcus near the window. She waited until there was a natural pause. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "my name is Olivia Martinez. I'm the relationship manager here." She kept her voice professional but not formal. "I want to say, when I reviewed your file after your appointment on Tuesday, I flagged it immediately. The application should not have been processed the way it was." Nate looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "I heard about that." She nodded, unsure what else to say. "Thank you for doing that," he said. He said it simply, without performance, like it genuinely mattered, because it genuinely did. She nodded again and moved away, and she carried that small exchange with her for the rest of the day with a feeling she could not quite name, but that was somewhere in the neighborhood of reassurance, that the things people do when they think no one important is watching still matter, that someone is always keeping account. The afternoon following the meeting was a different kind of quiet. The ordinary sounds of banking continued. Keyboards, calls, the structured hum of a branch in operation, but underneath all of it ran a current that everyone in the building could feel, and no one was quite ready to name. The kind of current that moves through institutions when something fundamental has shifted and people are still figuring out which of their ordinary assumptions they need to rebuild from scratch. Richard Coleman did not leave his office for 2 hours after the meeting. He sat at his desk and he looked at the wall, in the specific way people look at walls when they are not looking at the wall at all, but at the full accumulated weight of something they did. Not dramatically, just comprehensively. The way a person does an inventory they have been putting off for a long time. He thought about the appointment on Tuesday, about the weight he had given to a pressed shirt and clean but modest shoes, and no visible signals of institutional wealth, about the speed with which he had reached his assessment, about the fact that Nathaniel Brooks had placed a complete financial package on the conference table in front of him, and he had looked at one page with the attention he normally reserved for something he had already decided didn't need careful reading. He thought about the phone call to Gerald, about the voicemail he had left for Brooks, about how, for approximately 8 minutes after leaving that voicemail, he had felt that the worst of it was behind him. He thought about what that feeling, in retrospect, revealed about how thoroughly he had failed to understand what he had done. At 1:15 p.m., there was a knock on his office door. It was Olivia. She entered with the particular directness of a person who has decided to stop waiting for someone else to address something. "Do you have a few minutes?" she asked. "Yes," Richard said. She sat down. She did not hedge or soften what she said, and she did not say it with heat either. She said it the way professionals say things when they have concluded that the conversation is necessary and that the only way through it is with clarity. "I want to tell you what I saw when I looked at the Brooks file on Tuesday," she said, "because I think you need to hear it laid out plainly." He said nothing. He listened. She walked him through it. The portfolio summary, the audited asset valuations, the documented revenue of the initiative, the collateral position. What a standard review process would have produced within the first 10 minutes of a complete analysis. Richard listened without interrupting. "There was nothing in that file," Olivia said, "that indicated elevated risk. There was nothing in that file that indicated an incomplete borrower profile. The file contained documentation that would have satisfied our standard commercial lending criteria easily, and in fact exceeded them in most categories. She paused. What it didn't contain was a luxury watch or a tailored suit or a name that the person reading it already associated with wealth. Richard looked at her. "I'm not trying to," he began. "Richard." Her voice was careful but firm. "I'm not trying to make this harder than it has to be. I'm saying it to you plainly, because I think you are someone who, when confronted honestly with something, is capable of reckoning with it. And because I think you need to reckon with it, not just for this situation, but for what it means about how you've been operating." A long pause. "I know," Richard said. The two words landed quietly, without resistance. Not a performance of accountability. Just actual accountability, which sounds different. Smaller and less articulate and more real. Olivia nodded once. "Okay." She stood to leave, then stopped. "He mentioned me, by the way. Mr. Brooks. He said he heard I flagged the file." She looked at Richard with something that wasn't quite challenge and wasn't quite question, but was somewhere between the two. "Whatever happens with the review process, I just want you to know I'd do it again." She left. Richard sat in his office for a while longer. Then he opened his computer and began drafting a document he had been thinking about since the meeting ended. Not a memo, not a formal report, something closer to a personal accounting, a list of the steps in his Tuesday interaction with Nathaniel Brooks, annotated with a second column that asked, next to each step, what was I looking at, and what was I actually seeing? He worked on it slowly, the way you work on something you're not going to finish in one sitting and probably not in two. Across town, in the corner office of a different building, Nate Brooks was on a call with his board. The Brooks Holdings Group operated with a board of 7 individuals, a mix of former military officers, community development veterans, and institutional investors who had been with the group since its early years. They were not people who required drama or ornamentation in their briefings. They wanted facts, analysis, and a clear picture of what came next. "The building is secured," Nate said. "Marcus has the operational transition plan in place. Elena's team is handling the lease continuations for the upper floors. All existing tenants remain in place with standard transition notifications." "And the bank itself?" asked Patricia Okafor, the board's senior investment strategist, a 60-year-old former economics professor with a precision of thought that Nate had relied on for 12 years. "First Meridian stays in the lower 3 floors, Nate said. "For now, their lease continues. But we've opened a conversation with the regional president about what a formal partnership might look like, specifically around community reinvestment and veteran-focused lending programs." "What's your read on Harris?" Patricia asked. "He's a man who cares about the institution more than he cares about protecting the people in it who operate below his standards," Nate said, "which means he's the right kind of person to drive the changes that need to happen." He was genuinely appalled by Tuesday, not performatively, actually embarrassed. "And the branch manager?" Nate was quiet for a moment. "He made a decision based on what he thought he was seeing, instead of what the evidence showed him," Nate said. "That's a failure of professional process, but it's also a failure that a lot of people in his industry make every day, without ever having to reckon with it." A pause. "He's reckoning with it now. What he does with that is up to him." "And the atrium space?" Patricia asked. She had reviewed the acquisition brief and caught, as she always did, the detail that mattered. "Ground floor, approximately 4,000 square feet," Nate said. "I want to present a full design brief to the board within 30 days. The plan is to convert it into the 3rd regional hub for the initiative. Training rooms, a mentorship center, business resource infrastructure, and a dedicated space for veteran-owned business incubation. Timeline? 12 months from design approval to full operation. Budget?" Marcus, who was in the room, named a figure. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "That's well within our infrastructure allocation. What do we need from the board?" "A motion to proceed," Nate said. "I'll send the full brief within the week." The motion was made and seconded. The call ended with the efficient brevity of people who trust each other and do not waste time on what doesn't need to be said. After the call, Marcus closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair across from Nate. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said. Nate looked at him. "When you walked into that bank on Tuesday?" Marcus paused, constructing the question carefully. "Did any part of it bother you? The way you were treated?" Nate considered this with the same seriousness he brought to everything. "Yes," he said. "It always bothers me. Every time." He paused. "But I learned a long time ago to separate what bothers me from what I'm going to do about it. Anger is information. The question is what you build with it." Marcus nodded slowly. 26 years in the military, Nate said. "I spent a lot of those years being the most qualified person in a room that wasn't ready to see me as the most qualified person in the room. You either consume yourself with that, or you outlast it." He looked out the window at the Charlotte skyline. "I chose to outlast it." He picked up his coffee. "And then," he said, with the smallest trace of something that wasn't quite a smile but lived next to one, "sometimes, eventually, you buy the building." 3 weeks after the Thursday meeting in the First Meridian conference room, the Charlotte Business Journal ran a story. It was not the story anyone at First Meridian had wanted written about them. The headline read, "Veteran Investor Purchases Charlotte Financial District Building Days After Branch Declined His Loan Application." The story was sourced, careful, and detailed, built on public records from the property transaction, the Brooks Holdings Group's own communications about the acquisition, and several background interviews that the journalist, a woman named Dana Keaton, who covered the regional business beat with particular tenacity, had conducted with sources who preferred not to be identified. The story was accurate in all its material facts. It described the acquisition. It described Nate's background, his military record, the founding of the group, the scale of the holdings portfolio, the 6 years of the initiative's operation. It described with appropriate care and without naming Richard Coleman specifically that a loan application had been submitted, reviewed inadequately, and declined on the basis of an incomplete analysis. It did not speculate about the racial dimension of the encounter beyond noting, as a factual matter, that Nathaniel Brooks is black and that his loan application had been declined by a branch whose staff reviewed his materials without completing a standard analysis. It didn't need to speculate. The facts spoke with enough precision on their own. The story was published on a Wednesday morning. By noon, it had been shared several thousand times. By late afternoon, it had been picked up by 3 regional television stations and 2 national financial media outlets. By evening, it had landed on the front page of one of the largest black business publications in the country, which ran its own additional reporting and a commentary piece under the headline, "Nathaniel Brooks didn't need their loan. He needed to know if they deserved his business." Nate read both pieces in the morning, in his home office in the South Park neighborhood, a house that was substantial but not ostentatious, the kind of house that says, "This person has made very careful decisions for a very long time," rather than, "Look what I have." He read them with the focused, evaluative attention he brought to intelligence briefs, and at the end he set his tablet down and drank his coffee and thought about what the stories meant for the next phase of what he was trying to build. His phone began ringing at 8:30 and did not substantially stop. Calls came from the initiative's partner organizations in Virginia and Georgia, wanting to understand what had happened and what would follow. Calls came from other veteran advocacy organizations around the country, some of whom he knew and some of whom he did not. Calls came from journalists. 2 calls came from institutions he had never had contact with before, financial organizations that had read the story and wanted to have a conversation about community reinvestment and lending practices. He returned the calls he chose to return, in the order he chose to return them, and let Marcus and his communications director handle the rest. He did not give interviews, not because he was avoiding the story, but because he understood, as a matter of strategic discipline, that the story was already telling itself accurately, and that adding his voice to the media cycle would shift the focus from the substance to the spectacle, and the spectacle was not what this was about. What this was about, what it had always been about, was the space on the ground floor of a building on Tryon Street that was currently processing parking validations and serving adequate coffee, and which was going to become, within the next 12 months, a place where people who had served their country and then found themselves standing at the complicated, uncertain threshold of civilian life could come and find the resources, the guidance, and the community they needed to build something. That was the thing. The rest was context. Inside First Meridian Bank, the story's publication accelerated conversations that had already been in motion, but that now moved with a different quality of urgency. William Harris convened a meeting of the branch's senior leadership on the afternoon the story ran. He had seen it at 6 a.m. and had spent the morning on calls with the corporate communications team, the bank's legal department, and the regional board. The meeting was brief and direct. "I want to be clear about two things," Harris said. "First, the bank's official public response will focus on the process improvements we have already initiated and our commitment to equitable lending practices. We are not going to be defensive, and we are not going to be performatively apologetic. We are going to be specific about what we are changing and why." He looked around the room. "Second, whatever you may be feeling about the way this has played out publicly, I want you to understand something. The coverage we are receiving is not the problem. The coverage is a consequence. The problem was Tuesday morning, and the problem was systemic enough that it requires systemic change, not a one-time correction." He paused. "Richard will be transitioning out of the branch manager role effective the end of the month," he said. "This is not a termination. It is a reassignment to allow for a thorough process review and for a reassessment of role fit. Richard is a 16-year employee, and he will be treated with professional respect throughout this process." No one in the room said anything. "I am recommending to the regional board that Olivia Martinez be elevated to interim leadership of the branch's client relationship function, with a mandate to lead the process revision initiative." He looked at Olivia directly. "Olivia, I'd like to speak with you after this meeting." She nodded. Harris closed the meeting the way he opened it, directly and without ornamentation. People filed out. He remained at the table, looking at the window for a moment. Then he looked at the chair where Nate had sat 3 weeks ago, and he thought about the conversation they'd had in the days since. Quiet, professional, substantive conversations that had left Harris with the impression that Nathaniel Brooks was one of the most strategically patient people he had ever encountered. Not patient in the sense of passivity. Patient in the sense of a person who understands that the most durable results take longer to build than the most visible ones, and who is perfectly willing to do that work. He also thought about what it must have cost, over 57 years, to develop that kind of patience. And he understood, in a way he was not sure he could have fully articulated, that the costliness of it was not something he was in a position to fully measure. He stood up. He had calls to make. Richard Coleman, by this time, had developed a somewhat different relationship with Tuesday mornings. Since the meeting in the conference room, he had been working through his own extended internal accounting, not as a formal process required by the bank, but as something more personal and more uncomfortable than that. He had talked to Gerald again, at length, in a conversation that was considerably more honest than their previous one. He had talked to his wife, which was a harder conversation still. He had spent several evenings with the annotated document he had started in his office the afternoon after the meeting, the one where he listed every step of his Tuesday interaction and asked himself, at each step, what he had actually been seeing. The document had grown longer than he expected. What he found, examining it with the honesty that discomfort sometimes makes possible, was not that he had made one bad decision on one bad morning. It was that he had made the same decision so many times, on so many other mornings, in so many other forms, that it had long since stopped feeling like a decision and had started feeling like professional instinct, like reading a room, like the kind of judgment that 16 years of experience entitles you to. And the document, read in sequence, showed him something that was not comfortable to see, that the instinct he trusted was not, in the end, primarily a financial instinct. It was a social instinct, a pattern recognition system trained on signals that had nothing to do with creditworthiness or business viability, and everything to do with the immediate, surface-level presentation of a human being. He had been making financial decisions with a social instrument. He did not know what to do with this, exactly. But he thought that not knowing what to do with it was probably, for now, the right place to be. The alternative, understanding it quickly and then moving past it quickly, was the thing that had gotten him here in the first place. The months that followed were not a dramatic reversal. They were something harder and more durable than that. A rebuilding, conducted in the unglamorous register of daily institutional work. First Meridian's Process Revision Initiative, led by Olivia Martinez with support from an external consultancy that specialized in equitable lending practices, produced a comprehensive review of the branch's client intake and loan evaluation protocols. The review took 9 weeks. It examined 46 cases from the preceding 18 months. It found that in 11 of those cases, the initial documentation submitted by applicants had not been reviewed completely before a preliminary evaluation was rendered. In 7 of those 11 cases, the incomplete review had been a significant factor in the outcome. Olivia presented the findings to the regional board in a session that lasted 3 hours. She was precise, non-accusatory, and unsparing. She made 14 specific recommendations for process revision. The board adopted all 14. Implementation began the following month. It was not fast or visible work. It was the kind of work that happens in forms and checklists and mandatory review protocols, and the slow re-education of habits that have calcified into instincts. It was the kind of work that most institutions promise to do in moments of public accountability, and then allow to quietly dissolve when the pressure from the public moment fades. First Meridian, under the particular combination of Harris's leadership and Nate's institutional presence, as the building's owner, as a prospective partner, as a person who had made clear without drama that he was paying attention, did not allow it to dissolve. Nate attended one meeting of the process revision team at Olivia's invitation. He said very little. He listened. At the end, he made one comment. "The goal is not to create a system that would have approved my application," he said. "The goal is to create a system that evaluates every application on what the evidence actually shows. That's it. If you do that, the system will correct itself." He left. Olivia wrote those 2 sentences at the top of the final revision document. In parallel, the renovation of the ground floor of the Tryon Street building proceeded with the methodical care that Marcus Webb brought to all logistical work. The cafe and parking validation kiosks came out. The atrium was opened, cleaned, and reimagined. Architects and interior designers brought in for the project were given a clear brief: functional, welcoming, professional, built to last. Not impressive for impressiveness' sake. Built for the people who would use it, which meant built for people who were navigating the practical challenge of turning a skill set developed in service into a sustainable economic future. The construction ran 11 months, slightly under the 12 Nate had projected. Throughout the construction period, the initiative continued its work out of its existing locations in Raleigh, Richmond, and Atlanta. The Charlotte hub, when it opened, would bring the program's geographic footprint into the center of one of the fastest-growing financial markets in the southeastern United States. Nate visited the construction site every 3 weeks. He walked the floors, asked specific questions, made specific observations, and left specific notes. He didn't hover. He didn't micromanage. He trusted the people he had hired and checked in the way a person checks in when they trust people. But understand that vision requires consistent reinforcement to remain intact through the noise of execution. On one of those visits, a Tuesday in February, the light flat and gray through the building's street-level windows, he stood in the center of what would become the initiative's primary resource center and looked at the open space around him. Exposed beams, dust, the ghost of former function, a coffee counter in the corner, a folding table where a parking attendant once sat. Marcus was beside him, going through a construction update on his tablet. Nate stood there and looked at the space. He thought about Fort Bragg, 27 years ago, standing in a similar kind of empty room that was going to be built into something. He thought about the night before he deployed the first time, in a barracks that smelled like floor cleaner and old boots, going through his gear with the specific, focused attention of someone who understands that what you prepare with care is what keeps you whole. He thought about the other veterans who would walk through that atrium door. Men and women who had navigated the profound disorientation of returning from service to a civilian world that had continued moving without them, that spoke in a different language, that valued different credentials. People who had skills that were real and transferable, and often invisible to people who didn't know how to look for them. He thought about how much of what he had built, starting from a small real estate investment in 2003, had come from the thing his father had told him when he was 12 years old, and asking why they had to live the way they lived. The only thing they cannot take from you is the work you have already done. He stood in the empty atrium and thought about all of it. Then he said to Marcus, without turning away from the space, "How are we doing on the mentorship coordinator position?" Marcus glanced at his tablet. "We have 18 candidates. Elena is interviewing the final 4 next week. Tell her I'd like to sit in on the last 2. Done! Nate looked at the space a moment longer. Then he walked to the corner where the coffee counter had been and looked at the window that opened onto Tryon Street. People passed outside. Suits, briefcases, the ordinary theater of a Tuesday in the financial district. He watched them for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to the door. "Let's move," he said. They moved. The inauguration of the Charlotte hub of the Brooks Veterans Initiative took place on a Saturday in October, exactly 13 months after Nathaniel Brooks walked into First Meridian Bank on a Tuesday morning, waited his turn, placed a complete financial package on a conference table, and was asked, in the particular language of institutional condescension, whether he might be more comfortable somewhere else. The day was overcast, with the low, soft light that October sometimes offers in place of its sharper autumn clarity, the kind of light that makes everything look serious and considered, like the city is paying attention. The atrium had been transformed completely. Clean sightlines, warm materials, wood, glass, exposed brick on the north wall, a reception area with staff, a corridor of meeting rooms along one side, a large open resource center with workstations, a reference library, and 2 consultation offices for legal and financial advisory sessions, a training wing with 3 flexible classroom spaces, each named for veterans who had built significant enterprises after service. The naming wasn't ceremonial, it was instructional. Each room had a brief, framed narrative on the wall. Not a trophy, but a story. What the person had done in service, what they had faced coming home, what they built, and how. Nate had written the narratives himself. The inauguration event was not a gala. It was a reception, low-key by design, because Nate had been explicit with the communications team. This is about what the space is for, not about the moment of opening it. There were remarks, but they were short. There was a ribbon cutting. Marcus's idea, which Nate had agreed to with the mild tolerance of a man who understands that some things exist for the record and not for him. And then the space opened, and people moved through it the way you move through a place that is trying, in its architecture and its purpose, to communicate something specific to you. William Harris was there. He and Nate had developed, over the preceding months, the kind of professional relationship that grows out of a difficult starting point and survives because both people in it are willing to do the work that relationships require. Harris had implemented, at the regional level, several of the lending practice revisions that Olivia's team had recommended. He had also committed the bank, in writing, to a 3-year community reinvestment partnership with the initiative that included dedicated funding for small business lending programs specifically designed for veteran-owned enterprises. He had not needed to make that commitment. He had made it because he thought it was right, and because, having spent a year in the proximity of Nathaniel Brooks, had done what proximity to people of genuine integrity sometimes does. It had raised his own standards in ways he had not fully anticipated when the year began. He stood near the window of the resource center and watched people move through the space. He felt something that was not quite comfortable, and not quite pride, and was probably, if he was honest, somewhere in the vicinity of a person who has partially repaired something he damaged, and is aware, without illusion, of both the repair and the damage. It was not a comfortable place to be. He thought, genuinely, that it was probably the right place to be. Olivia Martinez arrived at the reception slightly late, having come from another commitment, and stood at the entrance to the atrium for a moment before walking in. She had been elevated 3 months earlier from interim status to a permanent leadership role, Director of Client Experience and Community Lending for the Charlotte branch, a newly created position that reflected, in its title, the specific kind of change the branch was trying to institutionalize. She had spent the last 3 months doing the work the title implied. It was not glamorous. It was checklists and protocol revisions and staff training sessions and individual conversations with colleagues who needed to understand, in practical terms, what equitable practice looked like when applied to the specific daily decisions of a commercial lending branch. Some of those conversations were easy. Some of them were not. She had done all of them. She walked into the atrium and looked at the space with the particular feeling of someone who has watched something be built from a painful beginning. She thought about the Tuesday she had read the Brooks file, about the number she had pointed to on the page in front of Richard, about the feeling in those moments that the right thing to do was clear and mattered and would cost her something she might not get back. It had not, in the end, cost her much, but she had not known that when she did it, and she would do it again the same way even if it had. She saw Nate across the room, speaking with a group of people she did not know. Veterans, she guessed from the way the conversation was moving, the body language of people who share a specific kind of experience and recognize it in each other. He was listening more than he was talking, which was, she had come to understand, his way. She did not interrupt. She found a coffee, actual good coffee, from a proper station in the corner that would serve as the space's permanent cafe amenity, and she walked through the rooms at her own pace. She read the narratives on the walls of the training rooms. She stood in the resource center and looked at the workstations, the library, the consultation offices. She thought about what this space would feel like in a year, the people who would sit at those workstations, the plans they would make, the things they would build. She felt, standing in that room, something she did not usually feel in institutional spaces, the sensation of being inside a place that was built with actual care for the people it would serve. It was more unusual than it should have been. Nate stood near the window at the far end of the atrium as the afternoon moved toward evening. The overcast sky outside had softened further. The street-level view showed the ordinary rhythm of a Saturday Charlotte, fewer suits than on weekdays, people moving with the particular looseness of a day that is not primarily about commerce. A man approached him, mid-40s, a precise bearing that marked him immediately. A handshake that told Nate everything before a word was said. The handshake of a person who has learned, through specific experience, that a handshake is never just a handshake. "Marcus tells me you were a ranger," the man said. "A long time ago?" Nate said. "You, 82nd Airborne, 2 tours, Kandahar. What are you building?" Nate asked. He always asked that first. "I'm trying to build a logistics consulting firm. 12 years I spent coordinating supply chains in places where the wrong decision cost lives. I know how to move things efficiently under conditions of uncertainty. I just don't know how to translate that into language that banks understand." Nate looked at him. "Sit down with our business development team today. Before you leave, tell them what you told me. That's the language. You just used it." The man looked at him with the expression of someone who has said something many times and had it not land, and who has now said it to someone who received it clearly and who is still adjusting to the difference. "I will," he said. Nate nodded. "Good." They shook hands again, and the man moved toward the resource center. Richard Coleman was not at the event. He had been reassigned to a different role in a different part of the organization, and his path through whatever came next was his own to navigate. He had reached out to Nate once, via a brief, careful email, to say something that was trying to be an apology and was, in its way, a sincere effort. Nate had read it and replied with 2 sentences. "I appreciate you sending that. The most important part of what you do next will be in how you treat the next person." He had not heard from Richard again. He did not know what Richard was doing with what had happened. He hoped it was something durable, but he had learned, over 57 years, not to spend his energy managing the outcomes of other people's reckonings. You could set an example. You could be honest. You could tell someone the truth without shielding them from its full weight. And then it was theirs. It was always theirs. Near the end of the afternoon, after most of the guests had cycled through and the space had begun to settle into the quieter, more intimate register of a reception winding down, Nate stood alone for a moment near the reception desk at the main entrance. He stood there and looked at the full length of the atrium, the clean sight lines, the warm light on the wood surfaces, the framed narratives on the walls, the people still moving through the resource center with the specific kind of attention that people bring to a place when they understand that the place exists for them. He thought about his father's voice. The only thing they cannot take from you is the work you have already done. He thought about a room in Fort Bragg 27 years ago that smelled like floor cleaner and old boots. He thought about a Tuesday morning in October, 13 months ago, and the particular quality of the silence in a conference room on Tryon Street when understanding arrived without any dramatic announcement, and a room full of people finally saw what had been sitting in front of them the whole time. He thought about all the versions of that Tuesday morning that had happened before that one, and would happen again after it, in other buildings, with other people, with the same casual, unexamined confidence that makes itself invisible to the person holding it, and entirely visible to the person receiving it. He thought about how much work that still was, how much was still left to do, and he thought that this room, this space, this specific, deliberate, unglamorous, lasting thing that had been built out of what Tuesday morning had made clear, was the answer to that work. Not a complete answer, not a final one, but a true one. You take what clarifies you. You take what costs you. You take what you learn from the room that told you to try a different door. And you build. Marcus appeared beside him. "You ready to go?" Marcus asked. Nate took one last look at the room. "Yeah," he said. He turned toward the door. Outside, Charlotte moved on its Saturday evening rhythm. The October sky had gone purple at the edges. The streetlights were coming on. The financial district had exhaled into the weekend. And in the building on Tryon Street, the building that, 13 months ago, belonged to people who had not seen what was standing right in front of them, something real was open. Something that would outlast the news cycle, the institutional memos, the public conversation, and the particular morning that had, in its failure, made everything else possible. It was open, and it was just getting started. The greatest opportunities are lost when we judge people by appearance instead of examining the evidence. True professionalism begins with respect, with listening, and with the willingness to see what is actually there.